Police department. Police department. Hello, yes. This is 37-year-old Jimmy Allen, and he's calling 911 from his home in Michigan. His voice is urgent, shaky, and strained with panic. He tells the dispatcher he just found his wife, Amy, in the basement. He says she's down there. He says he pulled her up. He says he tried CPR. The dispatcher immediately instructs him to keep going. Keep pressing. Keep breathing for her. Don't stop, because help is on the way. Multiple units are already being sent. Every second matters. But as police race to the Allen residence, something about the scene feels wrong. Officer Ben J. Horn is the first to arrive. He approaches the house expecting chaos, screaming, frantic movement, something. Instead, it's eerily silent. The kind of silence that makes your stomach tighten before you even step inside. Then, the officer announces himself. And only then does Jimmy start crying out. Help, yes, help! It's immediate, loud, emotional, like a switch flipped. Officer Horn enters, moving quickly toward the basement. And there, he finds Jimmy on the basement floor, sobbing over Amy's unresponsive body. Jimmy is performing CPR, pressing down hard, trying to bring her back. The officer asks the obvious question. How long has she been down? Jimmy says it can't be more than 20 minutes. But as the officer looks at Amy, something stands out. There are no obvious major injuries, no visible trauma that explains what happened. The only thing noticeable is a very faint mark near her jugular. More officers arrive. EMTs arrive. Within minutes, the basement fills with movement, people stepping around each other, equipment coming down the stairs, hands replacing hands as they take over CPR. Jimmy steps back, watching. And then, suddenly, he dramatically rips his shirt off and collapses onto the basement floor as if his body can't hold him up anymore. The emotion looks huge, overwhelming. But then it changes. He composes himself quickly. He stands again. He watches the EMTs work. And that becomes the pattern. Jimmy swings between controlled and explosive, calm and frantic, like his emotions are either perfectly packaged or spilling everywhere. One officer gently tries to move him away from the chaos. You want to come upstairs with me real quick? Jimmy agrees. He walks up the basement stairs calmly, so calm it feels almost too smooth, then enters the kitchen and explodes. He unleashes his anger onto the nearest object, a bowl of potato chips. He hits it, sends it flying, as if he needs something to break, because he can't break what's happening. The officers don't know what to make of him yet. They don't know what happened in the basement. They don't know what led up to this moment. All they know is this: a woman is unconscious. A husband is behaving unpredictably. And the story he's about to tell will need to make sense. They begin asking questions. Did Amy say anything? Did she make any statement? Jimmy says no. Then he gives them the timeline of the night. He says around 6:30 p.m., he and Amy dropped their daughter, Ashley, and Ashley's friend off at a nearby high school football game. After that, Jimmy says the two of them went downtown to get drinks. He says while they were out, they got into an argument. He says Amy walked home alone. He says he drove home in their car. When Amy got home, Jimmy claims the arguing continued. He says he left her alone to cool off. He says he went upstairs and put on a Jim Carrey movie, Ace Ventura. Then, when it was time to pick up their daughter, he says he went to check on Amy again. That's when he found her. The officers ask directly, does Amy have a history of anything like this? Jimmy says no, nothing in her background. Ever. The officers exchange glances. Because if Amy truly had no history of self-harm, no signs of instability, no warning, then why would this happen suddenly after an argument? Jimmy looks stunned. He keeps repeating how unreal this feels. I'm hoping I wake up, dude, but he doesn't wake up. And then an EMT comes up from the basement with something no one expected, a glimmer of hope. She's fighting. The EMTs found a faint pulse. Amy is still clinging to life. And as everyone reacts to that possibility, this tiny chance, Jimmy's face does something that alarms the officers. He doesn't look relieved. He looks frustrated. It's subtle, but it's there. Like the news doesn't match the emotional performance he's already committed to. That reaction hits the officers like a cold splash of water. It's not proof of anything, but it's a red flag. Jimmy steps out of the room and returns wearing a different shirt. Then he calls his daughter. He keeps his voice controlled. "We had an emergency. Don't go anywhere. I'll talk to you in a little bit." He doesn't want Ashley to panic. He doesn't tell her details. But right after that, he calls his parents, and now the emotion turns back on full volume. "I don't know what to do, Mom. I don't know what to do. This is terrible." He's crying hard. But an officer is watching his face closely. And that officer notices something unsettling. No moisture, no wet cheeks, no visible tears. The crying sounds real, but the evidence of it isn't there. So the officers decide to move Jimmy away from the basement and out of the immediate area. They keep him outside, separate from the scene. Amy is placed on a stretcher and rushed into the ambulance. The hospital is only minutes away, and the EMTs drive fast because time is everything. The basement is cleared. The noise fades. And now, with the immediate emergency handled, the officers go back downstairs to examine what's left behind. That's when they notice something that changes how they look at Jimmy's story. The basement ceiling is low, very low. Low enough, they start questioning the logistics. Amy was 5'6". The ceiling was roughly 7 feet. If someone had tried to hang from an extension cord down here, would it even work the way Jimmy implied? They don't jump to conclusions that night. They don't accuse him. They don't decide the case in the basement. They document what they see. They take mental notes. They leave, planning to come back with clearer heads. Because in cases like this, the first story is rarely the final story. The next morning, Officer Horn and his partner return to the Allen household. They want more detail. They want the day to make sense, from beginning to end. Jimmy describes the morning as normal, high spirits, breakfast, Ashley getting ready for school, music playing, lunch being made, smiles. He says around 7:30 a.m. he left for work, and Ashley left for school while Amy stayed home. He says he left work early and came home around 12:30 p.m. He says he took a nap. Then, in the afternoon, Ashley got out of school. Amy picked her up. Ashley had a friend over, Kayla. Jimmy says Amy made everyone dinner. Then, at around 6:30 p.m., they all drove to Tecumseh High School for the football game, dropped the girls off, and then Jimmy and Amy went downtown. Jimmy says they went bar hopping. First Ember's Bar and Grill, then JR's Hometown Grill and Pub. Investigators later confirm at least part of that story by obtaining security footage from JR's. On the footage, things don't look explosive right away. They look like a normal couple out for drinks. Then Jimmy explains what he says triggered the argument. He brought up selling their house, moving down south. The family had moved to Michigan from Florida about a year earlier, and Jimmy says he was thinking about their future, where they'd go next. He says Amy didn't like the idea. He says she became dismissive, negative, and then she made a comment that hit him hard. "I hope that works out for you, not for us, not for the family, for you." Jimmy describes it like a crack forming in front of him. He says he tried to explain he was talking about their life together, not a solo plan, not a selfish fantasy, but Amy kept shutting it down. And Jimmy says the tension built. He says by the time they left the bar, things were tight, bitter, unresolved. Amy decided she would rather walk home than sit next to him. Surveillance footage shows Amy walking down the street, heading toward their house. Jimmy says Amy arrived home at 7:58 p.m. He says she grabbed an extension cord. Then she went down to the basement. At 8:05 p.m., Jimmy says he went down to check on her. He says she was in the basement, upset, and they argued again. He claims Amy was angry because he slammed a door in her face when they left the bar. Jimmy insists it was an accident. He forgot to hold the door properly, but he didn't slam it intentionally. Amy didn't believe him. According to Jimmy, she started insulting him. They argued for about 10 minutes. Then Jimmy says he went back upstairs, leaving Amy in the basement with the extension cord. Time passes. At around 8:40 p.m., Jimmy realizes it's time to pick up Ashley from the football game. Before leaving, he says he went back down to the basement to squash the beef, and that's when he claims he found Amy. He describes seeing something overturned, like a kitty litter pail. He says he immediately checked for a pulse. He says he tried CPR. He says he called 911. The officers ask again, were there any signs this could happen? Jimmy says no, never. He describes their life as healthy, working out, rock climbing multiple times a week, cooking meals at home, growing vegetables, no financial problems, great job, good money. He paints the picture of a family at its peak. Then the officer asks permission to do a thorough search of the home. Jimmy agrees. With a new recruit, Louie, Jimmy's cat, wandering around the officers as they move room to room, they search for anything that might explain the night before. They don't find a dramatic, smoking gun in the house, but they do collect key items belonging to Amy, her computer, her phone, because answers often live in what people don't say out loud. After the search, Officer Horn speaks with Ashley. She is shaken, confused, still trying to understand how the world can change in a single night. The officer asks if her parents were fighting the day before. Ashley says no, everything was normal when she left. The officer asks if there's a history of fighting or arguing. Ashley says no, nothing ever. The officer asks about Amy's state of mind. Ashley describes her mother as introverted, shy, but emotionally stable. No signs that she was spiraling. No signs she was about to do something extreme. The interview doesn't give investigators what they need. And then Amy's family steps in, and everything changes. They approach police and tell them Jimmy waited 14 hours to notify them about what happened. They say when they heard, they rushed to the department because they had information they believed police needed to hear. They begin telling Amy's story from a different angle. Back in 1997, when Amy was just 13, she had a son named Caleb. Her parents looked after Caleb while Amy finished high school in Ocala, Florida. After high school, Amy began dating Jimmy. Jimmy stepped into the picture and, according to the family, became a father figure to Caleb. Later, Amy and Jimmy had Ashley. From that point on, Amy stayed home while Jimmy worked. But Amy's family claims staying home wasn't truly her choice. They describe Jimmy as controlling. They say he didn't want Amy to become financially independent. They say he monitored the family's behavior, social media, daily routines, what they ate. They say he disciplined the children harshly when he believed they were misbehaving. And when Amy tried to stand up to him, her opinion didn't matter. In their words, whatever Jimmy wanted, Jimmy got. Then they describe the breaking point with Caleb. When Caleb turned 17, he left to stay with his grandparents. And according to the family, Jimmy retaliated. They say Jimmy told Amy she was no longer allowed to speak with her family, including Caleb. They say Amy became isolated, and Caleb's contact with his mother faded to almost nothing. One of the last times Caleb saw her, they say, was at his high school graduation a year before the incident. This information reframes everything, because now it's not just a husband claiming shock at a tragedy. It's a family describing a pattern of control and isolation. But investigators still need motive. A case becomes stronger when the why is clear. And before detectives can fully build that why, tragedy hits. After 3 days unresponsive, Amy is taken off life support. She is pronounced dead. Now the stakes rise. This is no longer a medical emergency with unanswered questions. This is a death, possibly a homicide. Investigators push forward by digging into Amy's phone. In her texts with Jimmy, they find evidence of his controlling behavior. He appears to be tracking her movements, texting her exact locations, asking why she's there, questioning her constantly. But in conversations with others, Amy sounds different, more normal, more stable, more like the person Ashley described. And then investigators find messages that shift the entire center of the case. A conversation with a man named George, a married man from the East Coast. Amy had met him online and had been communicating with him for years. The messages are explicit, intimate, emotional, and it becomes clear this was an affair. Even on the day of the incident, Amy and George were texting and calling, during dinner, during family time. At one point, George texts, "I wish we could be together right now." Amy responds with excitement about seeing him again. And investigators remember something Jimmy mentioned. Amy texting someone during the argument at JR's. Now they believe she was texting George, while Jimmy sat right next to her. And from that, a theory begins to form. What if Jimmy saw something? What if he caught a glimpse of those texts? What if the argument wasn't just about moving? What if it was about betrayal? What if the anger followed Amy home? Investigators want to confront Jimmy with this. But there's another complication. Jimmy is gone. Days after the incident, Jimmy and Ashley pack up, including their 5 cats, and leave Michigan, heading back to Ocala, Florida, to stay with family. Police contact him and arrange another interview. Jimmy says he'll come back to Michigan later to retrieve belongings. Due to limited local resources, the Michigan State Police take over the case. Detective Larry Rothman is assigned. 1 month after Amy's death, Rothman sits down with Jimmy for a formal interview. Jimmy is calmer now. He's had time to rehearse his grief in private. He speaks about turmoil, confusion, not recognizing himself. He admits he was self-focused. He implies he might have missed signs. But moments later, when asked to describe himself, he gives a detailed, confident answer. Type A, structured, organized, ambitious, always improving himself, always improving those around him. He frames his controlling personality as a strength, a leadership role in the family. And investigators aren't impressed, because control disguised as high standards can still be control. Jimmy then describes Amy as shy, introverted, socially anxious. He mentions her isolating herself, playing video games compulsively, struggling to build friendships. He presents himself as the one who took measures to help her break out of it. But people close to Amy have already described something different, that Jimmy was the reason she was isolated. Then the detective shifts to infidelity. Jimmy admits he cheated once, years earlier. But when asked if he believed Amy was unfaithful, he dismisses the idea completely. He says it wouldn't be possible. He claims she didn't have the capacity to talk to people like that. Jimmy underestimates her. So Detective Rothman stops circling and says it plainly. He tells Jimmy they found evidence that Amy was having an affair. Jimmy denies it. So the detective prints excerpts from Amy's conversations with George. Messages that show affection. Messages that show planning. Messages leading up to the day of the incident. Jimmy reads them like he's reading a different woman's life. He keeps saying he doesn't believe it. He asks about phone records, wants to see numbers, wants more proof. He calls it crushing. The detective tries one more push, asks if Jimmy will take a polygraph. Jimmy agrees. He maintains innocence throughout. The results come back inconclusive. And now the case feels stuck. Jimmy is allowed to leave. He returns to Florida. Investigators can't force the truth to appear out of thin air, so they wait for what might clarify everything. The autopsy. 3 months after Amy's death, the medical examiner's report comes in. Cause of death: strangulation, asphyxiation. But the manner of death is undetermined. That single phrase becomes the new battlefield. Because undetermined isn't a conclusion. It's a question that demands more investigation. Detective Rothman goes back through every piece of evidence again, including body cam footage. He watches the scene from the beginning. He notices the moment Officer Horn pointed out the basement ceiling height. And that detail, small as it seems, sparks an idea. Rothman reaches out to a forensic engineering lab. He asks them to recreate the scenario Jimmy described. The extension cord, the basement, the height, the physical realities. After extensive testing and analysis, the lab determines that under the same circumstances, Amy's feet would have made contact with the ground. That matters, because it challenges the idea of full suspension. Then a different forensic pathologist reviews the results and concludes the manner of death must be homicide. The case swings back. 2 years after Amy's death, on October 16, 2020, Jimmy Allen is charged with open murder. Open murder means the jury will decide the degree, anywhere from involuntary manslaughter to first-degree murder. By this time, Jimmy is still in Florida, staying with his parents. And it appears, to outsiders, that he has moved on. He has a new fiancée, a wedding planned, just days away. But before he can marry, police arrest him and extradite him back to Michigan. When he's booked into jail, his charges are explained. He's told he can contact investigators if he has questions. And Jimmy responds with something that lands strangely. "This is how you sleep at night." The words hang there, heavy. Weeks later, at arraignment, Jimmy pleads not guilty. Bond is set at $10 million. He stays behind bars. His defense attorney issues a statement claiming Jimmy is innocent, cooperated fully, and has been jailed for a crime he didn't commit. Then, 3 years after Amy's death, the trial begins. The prosecution opens first, confident the evidence will guide the jury to a guilty verdict. The defense counters by calling the case speculation, arguing the story doesn't add up. They highlight Jimmy's phone searches from that night, searches for Jim Carrey movies and other shows, aligning with what he told officers. They imply that a man planning murder wouldn't be casually searching for entertainment. Then the prosecution calls a witness who changes the emotional temperature of the room. Caleb, Amy's son. Caleb testifies about an altercation with Jimmy years earlier, an incident where Caleb says Jimmy choked him from behind, hard, for several seconds. Caleb describes gasping for air, trying to grab anything, trying to escape. He says it felt like forever. That testimony matters because it introduces a pattern. Jimmy using choking as control, as punishment, as violence. If Jimmy could choke Caleb in anger, the prosecution argues, it's not a stretch to believe he could choke Amy. First responders and neighbors testify too. Several describe Jimmy's behavior at the scene as over the top, like an act. They talk about how he could sob uncontrollably, then instantly compose himself to answer questions. Body cam footage supports that observation. Then Officer Horn takes the stand and says something that echoes what he noticed from the start. Amy's injuries didn't match what he expected to see in a hanging. Another hospital staff member agrees. No visible injuries is a red flag. Then comes a witness almost no one expects. George, the man Amy was having an affair with. George testifies that they met online and spoke often. Texts and video calls, life conversations, and sexual content too. He admits they met in person twice, once for coffee, once at a hotel. He confirms their relationship had emotional weight, not just flirting. And he testifies that even on the day of Amy's death, they were talking about meeting again. Then the prosecution introduces the extension cord experiment through Dr. Elizabeth Buck. The question is blunt. Can an extension cord suspend 140 pounds? The testing says no. The prosecution argues this is enough to debunk Jimmy's version of events. Then it's the defense's turn. Jimmy's father testifies that Jimmy didn't flee Michigan because he was guilty, but because the family urged him to come to Florida. Ashley testifies as well, and her testimony shifts compared to what she told police initially. Now, she describes her mother as someone who overindulged in alcohol, became intoxicated easily, and could become meaner and more violent. The defense points to Amy's blood alcohol content, 0.09%, and frames it as proof of a drinking problem. They bring in their own expert, Dr. Francisco J. Diaz, who disputes homicide based on minimal internal findings and lack of defensive injuries. The defense argues that if someone is being choked, they usually scratch and fight. They argue Jimmy had no defensive marks. They also frame Amy's affair as fantasy, an escape, claiming she lived a double life fueled by isolation, guilt, alcohol, and emotional instability. Both sides rest. The jury deliberates for hours. Then the verdict comes back. Guilty of second-degree murder. Jimmy's reaction is muted, uncertain. He wanders. He seems lost in the moment. When he's taken back into custody, he waves goodbye to his family. Later, he is sentenced to 20 to 45 years in prison. And according to the case details presented, he will be eligible for parole in 2040. A family is left with permanent absence. A community is left with a question they'll replay for years. And at the center of it all is the moment that started everything. The 911 call, the basement, the faint mark on the neck, and a husband whose grief never looked the same twice. Because sometimes the loudest cries for help don't come from innocence. Sometimes they come from someone trying to control the story before the truth catches up. And in this case, the truth didn't arrive quickly, but it arrived, and it changed everything. If you were on that jury, what would you have believed? An unthinkable tragedy or a carefully staged scene? Drop your thoughts in the comments.